In this video, I'm going to build on my previous introduction to the Oxi One, the link is just up here, and show you how to hook your Oxi One up to a Eurorack modular system. We're going to cover everything you need to know from CV and gate interfaces to LFOs, envelope generation, and even how to do polyphony. So let's get stuck in. Now, how do you actually hook up your Oxi One to a modular system? Let's take a quick look at the back. As you can see, not only do we have the MIDI in and out ports here, but we also have 8 CV outputs and 8 gate outputs. The CV outputs can be used for sending pitch or envelope or LFO information, basically any control voltage you want actually. The gate outputs can send triggers that correspond to notes in the sequencers being played, or you can configure them to send out clocks. What's really interesting is this pipe port here. This lets you hook up a extra module called the Oxi Pipe, which you see here, which you can mount in your rack, and it actually breaks out all of these ports here into one module. So instead of connecting 16 cables out of the back of my Oxi One, which would take up a lot of space and be fairly messy, I can connect one cable. Here's the Oxi Pipe module, which I do really recommend you get. If you're serious about using your Oxi One with a modular system, I'd recommend getting this. It's a 6 HP module, not very deep, doesn't need any power, and it simply takes a HDMI connector in the front and breaks out the CV and gate information and the clock in and CV in as well. They supply you a HDMI cable. It's important to note it's a HDMI 2 cable. Don't get a HDMI 1 cable like I did at first, because it will not connect all of these ports. You need a HDMI 2 cable. I bought one on Amazon. I just bought this little expandable one here, which is actually really neat and tidy, because I can just connect it up like this and plug this in here. And now I have a very neat and compact connection between my Oxi One and my modular, and I don't have to have dozens of wires flying all over the place. All of the same things apply when you are sequencing modular. There's no difference between a sequencer generating notes for a MIDI keyboard or MIDI synths, shall we say, and one that will send out those same notes as CV and gate values to a modular. How do you actually configure these 8 outputs here, the gates and the CV output? How do you map them onto the sequencers? Well, this is where the CV gate screen comes into play. So press Shift and the LFO button, the little button there turns blue, and you now have a CV gate display. Now let's take a look at what we see here. The first 8 columns, you'll see them labeled CV, and the next 8 columns correspond to the 8 gate values. So quite logical, 8 columns for the CVs, 8 columns for the gates. So let me start off with a blank display here. How would I just send a note value out of sequencer 1? First of all, I want to use CV1 to send pitch information from sequencer 1. Now, if I wanted to use sequencer 2, I'd press this button. You see the screen says sequencer 2. The offsets allow you to apply an offset, a semitone offset, both negative and positive voltage. So you can tune ever so slightly up and down. And the output type is volt per octave, because that's what these Eurorack modules are expecting. The next 4 rows correspond to what is going to be sent out the CV. So we've already said select CV1, map it to sequencer 1. And now what am I going to send? If I press this button, I'm choosing to send pitch. This button allows me to send velocity. This pad allows you to create a trigger envelope. Now this is one of the features I really like in the Oxi One. It will generate envelopes, and they're just simple attack decay envelopes, but envelopes nonetheless for each of the notes. And the final pad allows you to send some modulation values out. So you could send out an LFO or some of the modulation values, which we will cover. So now we have CV1 set to pitch. How do we set the gate? We go over here and we press gate 1. Now let's wire up our first patch and actually make some sounds using the notes we've programmed in here. Let's take a cable. We will patch CV1 here into the 1 volt per octave input on the Ts-L. We'll patch gate 1 into the gain, and that's just a simple on-off gate for now. And we'll patch the wavefolded output, say, from Ts-L into ripples. Now let's hit play and see what we get. But right now we're just sending a gate into ripples and we're not really articulating the voice with an envelope. So now let's look at how we could actually use an envelope to actually create a little bit more movement and articulation in that sound. And I'm going to use CV2 to create an envelope. Remember, gates can just be on and off, but envelopes need to have a voltage because they're going to spike and come back down. And I'm going to go down here and I'm going to set the mapping for CV2 to correspond to a trigger envelope for sequencer 1. The attack parameter here is the attack. It's how long it takes the envelope to reach its maximum amplitude. We'll keep the attack short, but not 0. You can modulate this attack using different modulation sources. So for example, if you wanted to modulate the length of the attack, you could send the LFO into it. How do we actually set the amplitude and the decay length? Well, this is where we get to the velocity and the gate parameters. But when we're using the CV and gate outputs, velocity of the notes on the pads sets the amplitude of the envelope generated, and the gate is the total length of time of the envelope. So a longer gate means you'll have a longer decay time. Let's take a listen to what the sound sounds like now from Ts-L as we play around with these velocity and gate values. If the velocity is up at its maximum, the amplitude of the envelope is greater, and so naturally the sound is louder. But now let's increase the gate value. Right now it's on its midpoint of 50. As I increase that gate value, we're getting more time to hear the decay. Now that we've articulated our voice using an envelope, let's add modulation. Each of the sequencers in the Oxi One has an LFO attached to it. The rate is how often the waveform repeats. So it's like the frequency or the cycle of the LFO. It can be all the way down to a single step and all the way up to 16 bars long. So let's just set it to 1 bar. The LFO amount is the amplitude of the LFO, and I'm just going to set it to 50 because 50 is the midpoint. It goes from 0 to 100. And there's a variety of places you can, or destinations you can send the LFO. Pitch, velocity, the octave, all different MIDI CCs as well. We'll get to those in a later video. But for now, we're just going to choose velocity. So we're going to send the LFO to the velocity of each of the notes. Now I want to map the velocity output for this sequencer onto a CV output. So I go in here into my CV gate mapping by pressing Shift LFO, and I go down to second pad here on the third column. So this is CV3 is mapped onto sequencer 1, and I'm choosing the second pad here on the bottom grouping of 4 to choose the source of the output for CV3. These are the sources, remember? And I have it set to velocity. Now if I hit play, you'll see here illuminated bars which are visualizing how that output is changing over time. So we can see the triangle wave go up and come back down, up and down. Let's patch output 3 now into frequency. And as this bar goes up and down, the LFO is going up and down in amplitude. You can hear the filter. Each sequencer on the Oxi One has 4 modulation lanes, and you get to them by pressing the mod button here. And you can select them, mod 1, mod C2, and 3 and 4. And the little line shows you which one you've selected. You press it to enable it, press it again, and the circle is deselected and no values are generated. In this, you can actually adjust a fixed modulation setting. You can record and be drawing by turning the knob. I'll just clear that. Or best of all, you can take your finger and just draw out a modulation curve to your liking, depending on what you want. And that's going to be the voltage that's sent out. Let's take this waveform that I just drew on modulation lane 1 for sequencer 1. We'll go into our CV gate and let's use that now to modulate the filter. In the source field for CV output 3, I'm going to choose the bottom pad, which gets me to modulation. And I'm going to choose mod 1 as the type, and we leave the offset at 0. So far we don't hear anything. Now let's enable the modulation by pressing the knob. Now we hear it. See how the little illuminated bar now is changing? And if we go back over here, I can redraw this. And naturally, this can spread across multiple pages. Remember, we have 4 pages here. You're not just limited to 16 modulation steps. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can save them. So you don't so much save the modulations as you save the sequencer. I can save different modulation values. So I'm going to save this one into slot 5. Now, if I go in and load a pattern tree, there you see I have a totally different modulation matrix. Same notes being played, but totally different modulation. And that could create some very interesting effects as you're playing live, because you can have the same notes but modulate them differently, and you could create a whole performance of different modulations just by saving different modulation lanes here as different patterns. And then if you want to disable the modulation from playing and you just want to keep that waveform but you don't want to actually have it playing, press the knob and that will disable that modulation lane. As you can see, you can have a lot of fun by just drawing different modulation waveforms here and sending them into different places in your patch. Now that we've set up a mono voice here using our modules and a sequencer, let's add some drums. Now drums are a bit more straightforward because you're just sending triggers to a drum module. So I'm going to use the squid sample here for drums, and I'm just going to take the first 4 tracks out of it that I've loaded a kit into. I'll patch that into the B channels here on my mix switch so that we'll hear. And let's go down to sequencer 4. I'll just mute sequencer 1 for now. And here's a drum pattern I have programmed in, as we've had in my previous video. I tend to use sequencer 4 for drums. Now for simplicity, I'll choose the last 4 gate outputs as the drum triggers. So I just go here and tap in these 4 paths, and that says for sequencer 4, which is our multi-track sequencer, send out triggers. And on this one, it's going to be corresponding to track 1, which is the kick. That's track 1 down the bottom. This one is track 2, which is this track here, which I think is a hi-hat. Track 3 and track 4. Now when we go in here and hit play, this will generate gates. So let's patch those up real quick. Now let's unmute sequencer 1. That voice there on sequencer 1 is a little bit out of tune with that bass sample I have playing on track 4. How could I fix that without going in and manually retuning my oscillator? Well, for that, I can actually go in here and use the offset function here in the sequencer pitch in the CV gate settings. So again, press Shift, LFO. We're going to go to CV1 output here, which is this one here. And I'm just going to offset it so that they come in tune a little bit better. I think about 6 semitones is what I've found from testing this. So far, we've been making monophonic sounds, in other words, one voice, one sound using the Instruo Ts-L. But what if we wanted to use a polyphonic module? Polyphonic modules exist in Eurorack world, and I have an example of one here, which is this module called the center, which is a wavetable oscillator from 1 volt per octave. And what I've done is I've configured it to be 3 wavetable oscillators, each listening on 3 different CV inputs for pitch information. So I've got 3 wavetables loaded up here on the screen. I mix them together. I also have a VCA in here, so it needs an envelope. So we need to send this 3 pitches and an envelope. And we're going to configure this on sequencer 2. So I'm going to go into sequencer 2. You see here it's in chord mode. Chord mode allows me to send chord information rather than having to program the notes. I just say play this chord. I go into the CV gate page again as usual, and now I want to set sequencer 2. So I go to this line corresponding to sequencer 2, and I go 6, 7, and 8. These are the pitch information now to go to this oscillator, coming from voice 1, 2, and 3. I also need to send an envelope, and I'm going to use CV5 for that, and I've configured this input 1 here to be the envelope, and I'm going to set that there. I'm going to set an attack of, say, 3. And now if I go into here, I've also configured this to have a chord arpeggiator turned on. And that's the nice thing about putting a sequencer into chord mode. You can arpeggiate it within the chords. I'm in Dorian scale, so let's take a listen. That sounds pretty good. Well, this is crying out for some modulation, especially on QPAS. Typically, when I send stuff into QPAS, I'm modulating the filter frequency. I'm also modulating these two resonant peak rotations here to move resonant peaks around, and that allows me to add an awful lot of movement to the sound. So let's use our CV outputs over here to do that. But this time we're going to reconfigure them now to be on sequencer 2. So what we're going to do now is we're going to modulate the filter frequency using the velocity of the notes being played from sequencer 2. Now what I'm going to do is go into my LFO here for sequencer 2. I press the LFO and I'm going to map it to velocity. I'm going to set it to be, say, a sine wave over 2 bars, so it'll move quite slowly relative to the melody. And just a small amount of modulation, say an amount of 40 there, just to create a bit of filter movement here, which we can adjust using this attenuverter over here. Now let's add a bit more modulation, and I'm going to use, say, CV output 2 to modulate the rotation amount here on the resonant peaks. And that is set, we're going to set that to mod 1 because I want to draw in the modulation by hand like I showed previously. Now what I've done is, because the sequencer is set to be 4 pages long, I have 4 pages of modulation. Now let's take a listen, because now you'll hear the movement of the resonant peaks relative to each other as the modulation plays out from these curves I've drawn. Or shapes, really, they're not even curves. And of course, if I turn it off, that movement stops. I really kind of gave you the high-level overview of everything you need to know, and you can explore from there. Certainly, if you need modulation, envelopes, LFOs, the Oxi One can provide that to you, especially if you've got the Oxi Pipe like I have here. And if you have a complex patch with a lot going on, your Oxi One will form sort of the heart of your control center. I've got a lot more videos planned using this device in both modular and regular synths, so please stay tuned. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments down below. Any questions or comments or suggestions for future videos? I love hearing from people. And please subscribe so you'll stay up to date when I post a new video. Thanks for watching. And now let's jam so we can enjoy some of the music.